cut his mic, cut it now.
Sir, please, my mother is...
I don't care about your mother.
The audience went dead silent.
Look at what just crawled onto my stage. Ripped clothes, dirty fingernails. You smell like you slept in a dumpster.
I just want to sing for her. She's dying.
Then go sing at her funeral. This is my stage, not a shelter for strays.
He grabbed the scorecard and ripped it in half, in front of 5,000 people.
Get out before I have them drag you out!
The boy stood still. His hands shook, but his eyes didn't break. That judge cut off a boy mid-audition for singing to his dying mother. But what no one in that room knew was who that judge really was to that boy. Mason Harper was born in a trailer park on the edge of Meridian, Mississippi, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear the rain, and the rent was still too high. He was 19. He had never met his father, and the only thing his mother ever told him about the man was nothing at all. Linda Harper didn't talk about the past. She worked 2 jobs, 3 on holidays. She cleaned offices before sunrise and stocked shelves after dark. And somewhere in between, she raised a boy who never once heard her complain. Not about the money, not about the pain in her chest that started in spring and never left. She used to sing. That was the one thing Mason knew for certain. Every night when he was small, Linda would sit on the edge of his bed and sing "You Are My Sunshine" until his eyes closed. Her voice was low and warm, the kind that made silence feel like something worth protecting. Mason learned to sing by listening to her breathe between the notes. By the time he was 12, his voice was stronger than hers. By 14, people at the church on 5th Street started coming just to hear him. Pastor Williams called it a gift. Linda called it his way out. But ways out cost money. And money was the one thing the Harpers never had. The cough started in March. Linda waved it off, said it was allergies, said the dust from the trailer got into everything. But by June, she was coughing blood into the kitchen sink and hiding the stained towels under the mattress so Mason wouldn't see. He saw. He found the hospital bills, too, stacked in a shoebox behind the winter coats. $180,000. The number didn't even look real. Stage 3 lung cancer. The diagnosis was typed in small black letters on a white form, and Linda had folded it so carefully that the creases had turned soft. Mason didn't cry when he read it. He sat on the floor of the closet for a long time, holding the paper. And then he put it back exactly where he found it. He never told her he knew. He picked up a second job instead, washing dishes at Cortland's Diner from 6 to 10 every night after school. His hands cracked from the hot water and the cheap soap. He did homework on the bus. He fell asleep in class. His grades dropped. None of that mattered. What mattered was the jar under his bed. He counted it every Sunday. $42, $61, $89. It was never enough. It was never going to be enough. Nurse Beth Dawson was the first person who said the truth out loud. She worked the night shift at Meridian General, the floor where Linda spent more time than she did at home. Beth had seen 100 patients come through those doors, but something about Linda made her stay a little longer each visit. Maybe it was the way Linda always asked about Beth's daughter before Beth could ask about Linda's charts. Maybe it was the gold ring Linda never took off, a thin band with the letters R and L scratched into the inside, worn so smooth you had to tilt it toward the light to read them. One Tuesday night, Beth found Mason sitting alone in the hospital hallway. He was humming, not performing, just humming, a melody that floated up from somewhere deep, something that sounded like it had been living in his chest for years. Beth stopped walking. She stood there for a full minute, listening. "Mason." He looked up, eyes red, hands still raw from the diner. "There's a show, Voice of Tomorrow, national TV. Grand prize is $100,000. He shook his head. I can't leave her. You can't save her by sitting in this hallway either. That landed hard. Mason didn't answer. Beth sat down beside him. Your voice, Mason. I've heard a lot of people sing, but yours sounds like someone I heard a long time ago, someone I can't quite place. She frowned, like the memory was just out of reach. Mason didn't ask who. He was already looking at the contest flyer Beth had pulled from her pocket. The deadline was in 6 days. In the room behind them, Linda's oxygen monitor beeped. Steady. Fading. Mason recorded his audition video on a Wednesday night. He propped his phone against a cereal box in the kitchen, hit record, and sang "You Are My Sunshine" with the faucet dripping and the neighbor's dog barking through the wall. He watched it back once. His shirt had a stain near the collar. The lighting made his skin look gray. He almost deleted it. He sent it anyway. 4 days later, his phone buzzed during a shift at Cortland's. His hands were elbow-deep in dishwater. He dried them on his apron and read the email 3 times. Congratulations. You've been selected for the live audition round of Voice of Tomorrow. Please report to the Grand Ole Theater in Nashville, September 14th. Nashville was 260 miles away. The bus ticket cost $48. Mason had 31 in his jar. He didn't tell anyone for 2 days. He worked his shifts, sat with Linda at the hospital, and stared at the trailer ceiling doing math that never added up. Tommy Reed noticed first. He'd been Mason's best friend since 4th grade. Loud where Mason was quiet. Reckless where Mason was careful. The kind of person who'd give you his last $5 and ask to borrow 3 back. He found Mason on the trailer steps, staring at his phone. What's wrong? Mason showed him the email. Tommy didn't say congratulations. He said, how much do you need? By Sunday, Tommy had $212, $40 from his own savings, the rest from 5th Street Baptist, passed around in a collection plate after Pastor Williams read the email to the congregation. The night before Mason left, he sat beside Linda's hospital bed. She was so thin the bones in her wrists looked like they might come through. She reached up and unclasped the gold ring from the chain around her neck. Sing with your heart, baby. Mason closed his fingers around it, still warm from her skin. She opened her mouth. Something about the letters, about the man who gave it to her. But the cough came hard, and by the time it stopped, her eyes were closed. He kissed her forehead, slipped the ring into his pocket, and walked to the bus station alone. The bus dropped Mason off at the Nashville station at 6 in the morning. He had a backpack with 2 shirts, a toothbrush, and a granola bar. The ring sat in his front pocket, pressing against his thigh with every step. The Grand Ole Theater was bigger than anything he'd ever seen. Glass doors, polished marble floors, security guards in blazers. Mason stood outside for 10 minutes, watching other contestants walk in with rolling suitcases, vocal coaches, and parents carrying garment bags. One girl had a whole team. A man adjusting her earpiece, a woman blotting her makeup, a photographer walking backward in front of her. Mason walked in alone. The backstage holding area was a long hallway lined with mirrors and folding chairs. The air smelled like hairspray and cologne. Contestants warmed up in clusters, running scales, sipping honey tea from thermoses their mothers packed. A boy named Brandon Wells leaned against the wall in a tailored blazer and white sneakers that probably cost more than Mason's rent. He looked Mason up and down, the wrinkled shirt, the frayed backpack strap, the shoes with the sole peeling off the left toe. Hey, did you walk here from a cotton field? 2 girls nearby laughed. Someone recorded it on their phone. Mason said nothing. He found an empty chair at the end of the hallway, sat down, and pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked across the corner. He opened the last photo of Linda, taken 3 weeks ago in the hospital bed, smiling, oxygen tube in her nose, holding up a thumbs up like everything was fine. His phone buzzed. A text from Beth. Your mom was admitted to the ICU last night. She's stable, but it's getting worse. I didn't want to tell you before your trip. I'm sorry. Mason read it twice. He put the phone face down on his knee. He pressed his palms together and squeezed until his knuckles turned white. For a full minute, he considered walking out, going back to the bus station, going home. Then he looked at the photo one more time. The thumbs up, the oxygen tube, the smile that cost her everything. He stood up. He buttoned his wrinkled shirt to the top, and he walked toward the stage door. The stage was a wall of light. Mason could feel the heat from the spotlights before he even crossed the threshold. 5,000 seats, every one filled. Cameras mounted on cranes swung in slow arcs above the audience like mechanical birds. A stagehand clipped a microphone to his collar and gave him a look that said, "Good luck," without saying it. Mason nodded. His mouth was dry. His palms were wet. The ring pressed against his thigh through the thin fabric of his pocket. He stepped into the light. The audience was a blur. Rows and rows of faces melting into one wide, breathing mass. The front row was close enough to touch. A woman in a red dress whispered something to the man beside her. A teenager held up a phone, already recording. And then there were the judges. 3 of them sat behind a long, curved desk at the center of the floor, elevated just enough to look down at whoever stood on stage. Each had a microphone, a glass of water, and a red button the size of a fist. Elena Whitfield sat on the left. She was 71 years old, a retired opera soprano who had performed at La Scala, the Met, and Carnegie Hall. Her back was straight. Her eyes were sharp. She looked at Mason the way a jeweler looks at a rough stone, not with doubt, but with patience. Derek Simmons sat in the middle. He was a producer, 40 years in the industry, 3 Grammy wins. He wore a gray suit and a calm expression, the kind of man who had heard 10,000 voices and could tell within 8 bars whether the next one mattered. Richard Cole sat on the right. He was the one everyone watched, CEO of Pinnacle Records, the man who made and broke careers with a single phone call. His reputation wasn't built on kindness. It was built on results. He leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his eyes already bored. He looked at Mason the way a man looks at a stain on his shoe. But there was something else, something that lasted only a fraction of a second. When Mason stepped into the spotlight, Richard's eyes changed. Not softened, not widened, just shifted, like a door cracking open and slamming shut before anyone could see what was behind it. No one in the audience noticed. The cameras didn't catch it. But it happened. "State your name," Derek said. "Mason Harper, from Meridian, Mississippi." "And what will you be singing for us today, Mason?" "You Are My Sunshine, Sir." A ripple went through the audience. A few people smiled. It was a children's song, a lullaby. Not the kind of thing you bring to a national competition. Richard Cole leaned into his microphone. "You came all the way to Nashville to sing a nursery rhyme?" "It's my mother's song, sir. She taught it to me." Richard didn't respond. He picked up his pen and wrote something on his notepad. The gesture was deliberate, a way of saying, "You've already lost," before Mason sang a single note. Mason closed his eyes. He thought of Linda, the hospital bed, the oxygen tube, the way she hummed between coughs when she thought no one was listening. He opened his mouth. The first note came out wrong. Not terrible, just tight, strained, like his throat had locked around the sound and wouldn't let go. His voice cracked on the second line. A murmur rippled through the audience. Someone in the balcony whispered, "Oh no." Richard Cole's hand moved to the red button. He pressed it. The buzzer tore through the theater like a gunshot. The red light on Richard's desk flashed twice. The audience gasped. Mason flinched, but stayed on his feet. "Stop," Richard said. "Just stop." The theater was silent. "This is a professional competition, not a charity karaoke night. If you can't handle the pressure, you shouldn't be here." He waved his hand. "Next." Mason stood there. The spotlight felt heavier now, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. He could feel 5,000 pairs of eyes. He could feel the cameras. He could feel his own heartbeat in his ears. "Please," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "My mother is dying. This is all I have." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Elena Whitfield spoke first. "Let the boy sing." Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The audience heard every syllable. Derek nodded. "I agree. One more chance. From the top." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at Elena, then at Derek, then back at Mason. 2 against 1. He leaned back and said nothing. Mason stood alone on the stage. The buzzer light was still glowing red. The microphone picked up the sound of his breathing, short, shallow, fast. He closed his eyes again. This time he didn't think about the crowd. He didn't think about the judges. He didn't think about the cameras or the prize or the hospital bills stacked in a shoebox behind the winter coats. He thought about Tuesday nights, Linda sitting on the edge of his bed, her voice barely louder than the crickets outside the window. The way she'd brush his forehead with the back of her hand, not checking for a fever, just touching him because she could. He opened his mouth, and what came out was not the same voice. It started low, a hum, almost subvocal, like the sound was coming from the floor itself, rising through his bones, through the soles of his broken shoes, up through his chest and into the air. Then it opened. The note climbed, clean, effortless, impossibly wide. It filled the theater the way water fills a glass, edge to edge, without spilling. The audience stopped breathing. A woman in the third row pressed her hand to her mouth. A man in the balcony set his phone down because he forgot he was recording. Mason sang Amazing Grace. Not the hymn book version, not the choir version. His version. Stripped down, raw. Gospel roots wrapped in something that had no name. Something that lived in trailer parks and hospital hallways and the spaces between a mother's heartbeat and a son's first cry. His voice broke on the line, "I once was lost." Not from weakness, from truth. And when he hit, "But now I'm found," the note soared so high and held so long that Elena Whitfield, a woman who had stood on the stages of every opera house in the world, closed her eyes and let the tears run. Derek Simmons leaned forward. His pen had stopped moving. His mouth was slightly open. The audience rose. Not all at once. The front row first, then the middle, then the balcony. A wave of bodies standing in silence. Not clapping, not cheering, just standing. Because sitting felt wrong. And Richard Cole. Richard Cole didn't move. His hands were flat on the desk. His face was white. Not angry, not impressed. Something else entirely. Something that looked, for just a moment, like recognition. His right hand drifted to his chest, to a spot just below his collarbone where, if the cameras had zoomed in, if anyone had thought to look, a tattoo sat beneath his shirt. 2 letters, old ink, faded. R and L. No one saw it. Not yet. Mason finished the last note. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the theater erupted. 5,000 people screaming, crying, stamping their feet. Elena stood and applauded. Derek stood and applauded. Confetti didn't fall. Lights didn't flash. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was the kind of moment where a boy in ripped shoes stood under a spotlight and made the whole world Stop. Mason wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He whispered 2 words into the microphone that only the front row could hear. For you, Mom. Mason made it through. Top 20. The notification came on a piece of paper slipped under the door of his shared hotel room, a room the show provided, the first time Mason had ever slept on a mattress that didn't sag in the middle. He read the paper sitting on the edge of the bed, still in his shoes, because some part of him expected someone to come take it back. Nobody came. The second round was scheduled for Saturday. Each contestant would perform 1 song, chosen by the show's music director in consultation with the judges. The list went up Thursday morning on a bulletin board in the backstage hallway. Mason found his name near the bottom. Song assignment: Autumn Leaves, Nat King Cole arrangement. Jazz standard, complex phrasing, chromatic runs, the kind of song that required years of conservatory training and a voice that could move like smoke through a keyhole. Mason had never sung jazz in his life. He looked at the other assignments: pop ballads, R&B classics, gospel anthems. Every other contestant had received a song that fit their style, their range, their strengths. Mason had received the one song designed to make him fail. He knew who did it. He didn't need proof. He could feel it, the way you feel someone watching you from across a dark room. The show's assistant director, a young woman with a clipboard and tired eyes, confirmed what Mason already suspected. The music director approved all the assignments, she said, but Mr. Cole made a special request for yours. Said he wanted to see if you had range. Range. That was the word Richard used. Like sabotage was a favor. Mason sat in the stairwell behind the theater for an hour. The concrete was cold against his back. He held his phone and thought about calling Beth, calling Tommy, calling anyone. Instead, he called the hospital. The nurse who answered wasn't Beth. She said Linda was sleeping. She said the latest scan showed the tumor had grown. She said the doctor wanted to discuss hospice options. Mason hung up. He pressed the phone against his forehead and breathed. 2 days. He had 2 days to learn a song he'd never heard, in a genre he'd never studied, against contestants who'd trained their entire lives. He almost gave up. He sat in that stairwell and let the thought wash over him like cold water. Just go home. Just hold her hand. Just be there when it happens. The prize money was a fantasy. The competition was rigged. The man behind the desk had made sure of it. Then his phone buzzed. A voicemail. Old. Saved. From 3 months ago. He'd kept it because he couldn't bring himself to delete it. Linda's voice, thin and breathy, singing between coughs. Not a lullaby this time. Something different. A melody that swung. A rhythm that swayed. A voice that, even at its weakest, bent notes like warm glass. Jazz. His mother had sung jazz. Mason played it again. And again. He closed his eyes and listened to the way she slid between the notes, not hitting them clean, but leaning into them, letting them blur at the edges, the way only someone who'd lived inside music could do. He'd never asked her about it. She'd never offered. But it was there, in her voice, in her bones. And now, sitting in a cold stairwell 260 miles from her hospital bed, Mason heard it for the first time. He stood up. He went back to his room. He played the voicemail on a loop and sang along, matching her phrasing, note by note, breath by breath. He didn't try to sound like a jazz singer. He tried to sound like her. By Friday night, he had something. Not polished, not trained, but real. A gospel singer's instincts wrapped around a jazz framework, held together by something that no conservatory could teach. The DNA of a woman who once sang in smoky clubs before life pulled her somewhere else. Richard Cole had changed Mason's song to expose a weakness. He didn't know he'd handed Mason his mother's language. That same night, backstage, Mason passed a half-open dressing room door. Richard's voice, low and tight, leaked through the gap. "I told you, that kid cannot win. You don't understand. It's complicated." A pause. Then, "Just make sure he doesn't make it past Saturday." Mason stopped walking. His hand tightened around the ring in his pocket. He didn't knock. He didn't confront. He kept walking. But now he knew. Saturday night, round 2. The theater was packed again. 5,000 seats, every one full. And this time, the energy was different. People had seen the clips. Mason's audition had already hit 40 million views online. Half the audience was there because of him. He walked out in the same wrinkled shirt, the same broken shoes. The crowd roared before he opened his mouth. Richard Cole sat behind the desk with his arms folded. His face was stone. Elena Whitfield adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. Derek Simmons clicked his pen. The band started playing. Autumn Leaves. Smooth, slow, sophisticated. The kind of arrangement that expected a trained voice to float above it like silk. Mason didn't float. He planted. His first note landed low and heavy, rooted in gospel dirt. He bent the melody sideways, pulling it apart and rebuilding it in real time. Jazz phrasing he'd learned from a voicemail. Swing he'd absorbed from a dying woman's muscle memory. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polished. It was something else entirely. It was Linda Harper singing through her son. The audience didn't know that. They only knew that the sound coming off that stage didn't match any category they'd ever heard. It was gospel. It was jazz. It was blues. It was a 19-year-old boy who had no business being this good, singing a song he'd learned 48 hours ago, like he'd carried it his whole life. When the last note faded, Elena Whitfield removed her glasses and set them on the desk. Her hands were shaking. "That voice," she said, "doesn't come from training. That comes from the soul." Derek Simmons nodded slowly. "I've been in this industry 30 years. I haven't heard anything like that. Not once." Richard Cole said nothing. He didn't vote yes. He didn't vote no. He sat perfectly still while Elena and Derek sent Mason through to the top 10. His pen lay untouched on his notepad. His water glass was full. By midnight, #LetMasonSing was trending in 11 countries. The clip hit 60 million views by sunrise. Fan accounts multiplied by the hour, and one of them, buried deep in a thread that wouldn't go viral until later, posted an old photograph of a young Richard Cole standing outside a church in Meridian, Mississippi. The same church where Mason learned to sing. Nobody connected the dots. Not yet. Round 3, top 10. The stakes were no longer abstract. The finale was 2 performances away, and the grand prize had gone from fantasy to possibility. Mason could feel it in the way people looked at him backstage. The other contestants who had once ignored him now nodded when he passed. A few shook his hand. One gave him a bottle of water without being asked. Richard Cole felt it too, and it made him dangerous. The first move came the morning of the performance. Mason arrived at the theater for sound check and found his microphone missing from the rack. A stagehand said it had been reassigned. Technical issue, nothing personal. Mason would be using a backup unit, older, quieter, the kind they kept for rehearsals, not live shows. Mason didn't argue. He tested it once, heard the thin, tinny output, and said nothing. The second move came during the performance itself. Mason was 3 minutes into his song, a stripped-down arrangement of Bridge Over Troubled Water that he'd rebuilt from memory after hearing Linda hum it in the hospital, when the sound cut out. Not a fade, a kill. The monitors went dead. The backing track vanished. Mason's microphone dropped to a whisper so faint that only the first 2 rows could hear him. The audience murmured. A few people booed. The sound engineer in the booth looked confused, then looked at something off stage, someone, and sat back in his chair. Mason stood in the silence. 5,000 people watching, cameras rolling, his voice trapped inside a dead microphone. He closed his eyes. He unclipped the mic from his collar. He set it on the floor. And he sang without it. The first note was raw, unfiltered. It came from his diaphragm, passed through his chest, and hit the back wall of the theater like a wave. No amplification, no effects. Just a boy's voice filling a room built for orchestras. The audience froze. He sang the chorus of Bridge Over Troubled Water a cappella, standing center stage with his arms at his sides and his eyes closed. His voice climbed. It cracked at the edges, not from weakness, but from weight. The weight of a hospital bed. The weight of a shoebox full of bills. The weight of a mother who might not make it to tomorrow. The first person to stand was a woman in the balcony, then a man near the aisle, then a teenager in the nosebleeds who screamed so loud the cameras picked it up. Row by row, the theater rose. Not politely, violently. 5,000 people on their feet, some crying, some shouting, some recording with their phones held high like candles at a vigil. Backstage, someone had already pulled out their phone and started recording the sound booth. The footage would surface within hours. A man in a headset receiving a text, then reaching for the audio board. The text was from a number registered to Pinnacle Records, Richard Cole's company. The clip hit the internet before the episode finished airing. Hashtag Sabotage Mason trended alongside hashtag Let Mason Sing. News outlets picked it up. Entertainment journalists wrote op-eds. The show's producers issued a statement calling it a technical malfunction under investigation. No one believed them. Richard Cole appeared on a late-night segment the following evening. He smiled. He called the accusations absurd. He said Mason was talented but emotionally unstable and not ready for the industry. He suggested, lightly, carefully, that the boy's entire story might be exaggerated. The sick mother, the poverty, the trailer park. Everyone wants a victim narrative these days, Richard said, adjusting his cufflink. It sells, but it doesn't mean it's real. 300 miles south, Sandra Cole sat in the living room of the house Richard had bought her. She watched her husband's face on the television screen. She watched him lie. Then she looked at the framed wedding photo on the mantel and looked back at the screen, at Mason's face, frozen in a thumbnail beside Richard's interview. The resemblance was unmistakable. Sandra picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't called in years. A journalist. Someone she'd once trusted with a smaller secret, a long time ago. She pressed call. On the other side of Nashville, Elena Whitfield sat in her dressing room and watched the same interview. When Richard said the words, emotionally unstable, she turned off the television, picked up her phone, and typed a single sentence to the show's executive producer. If that man is still on the panel next week, I walk. The call Sandra Cole made that night went to a woman named Claire Bennett, investigative journalist, 12 years at the Nashville Tribune, the kind of reporter who never published a story until she had 3 sources and a paper trail. Sandra didn't give her everything at once. She gave her a thread. My husband lived in Meridian, Mississippi 20 years ago. He was a different man then, a different name almost. Look into it. That's all I'll say for now. Claire looked into it. What she found started small, a rental agreement from 2006 signed by a Richard A. Cole for a 1-bedroom apartment on Poplar Street in Meridian. A membership card for a jazz club called the Blue Door. A photograph in the Meridian Star's community section. Richard, younger, thinner, standing outside 5th Street Baptist Church with his arm around a woman. The woman was Linda Harper. Claire dug deeper. She pulled county records. She cross-referenced dates. She made phone calls to people who still remembered the couple, the landlord who rented them the apartment, the pastor who married them in a quiet ceremony that never made it to the papers, the neighbor who heard them argue the night Richard left. He left in the fall of 2006. Linda was 5 months pregnant. He didn't leave a note. He didn't leave money. He left the ring, the gold band with R and L engraved inside, sitting on the kitchen counter next to a half-empty cup of coffee. By the time Claire connected the last piece, she was sitting in her car outside the Meridian Courthouse with a certified copy of a birth certificate in her lap. Father, Richard A. Cole. Mother, Linda M. Harper. Child, Mason R. Harper. Born March 14, 2007. Claire locked the document in her desk drawer and called Sandra back. I have it. When do you want this to go public? Sandra was quiet for a long time. Then she said, after the finale. Let him sing first. He deserves that. Meanwhile, the world kept spinning around Mason without telling him any of it. Back in Meridian, the community had already rallied. Fifth Street Baptist held a prayer vigil the Sunday after the Mike incident. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit and said, that boy didn't just sing for himself. He sang for every person in this town who was ever told they weren't good enough. The congregation raised their hands. Some wept. The collection plate went around twice. Tommy Reed, who had been glued to his phone since the first audition, launched a GoFundMe page titled Save Linda Harper. He posted Mason's story, the trailer, the cancer, the hospital bills, the 2 jobs. He attached a photo of Mason at age 12, singing in the church choir, gap-toothed and grinning. The page raised $50,000 in 48 hours, then $100,000. Then it slowed, and Tommy didn't care because the number had already surpassed the hospital debt. Strangers from states Mason had never visited were paying his mother's medical bills. Beth Dawson recorded a video of Linda watching Mason's a cappella clip on a tablet in her hospital bed. Linda's face was thin. Her arms were bruised from the IVs. But when Mason's voice filled the room, raw, unfiltered, no microphone, she smiled the way she used to smile when she sang him to sleep. The video went viral within hours. 14 million views. Comments in languages Mason couldn't read. And in a practice room on the 3rd floor of the Grand Ole Theater, Elena Whitfield spent 2 hours every evening that week teaching Mason things no competition coach could. Not technique. He had enough of that on instinct. She taught him control. How to hold back so the release hits harder. How to breathe between phrases so the silence carries weight. How to turn a performance into a conversation between one voice and 5,000 hearts. You have something I've only seen twice in my career, Elena told him on the last night before the finale. The ability to make strangers feel like you're singing only to them. Mason nodded. He didn't know what to say to that. He was thinking about his mother. Elena put her hand on his shoulder. Sing for her tomorrow. Forget the judges. Forget the cameras. Just sing for her. Mason touched the ring in his pocket. That's all I've ever done. Finale night. 15 million people watching live. The Grand Ole Theater had never been this full, this loud, this electric. Every seat taken, people standing in the aisles, camera crews from 6 networks, a helicopter circling the building for aerial shots. Mason waited backstage with the ring in his left hand. He wasn't squeezing it this time. He was holding it the way Linda held it, gently, like it might break, like it was the last warm thing in a cold room. A producer with a headset leaned through the curtain. You're up, Mason. Final performance. He walked out. The roar was immediate. 5,000 people screaming before he reached the microphone stand. Signs in the crowd. his name painted on poster boards, a woman in the front row holding a candle. The noise was so loud it buzzed in his teeth. Then the lights dimmed, the crowd went quiet, and a screen behind Mason flickered to life. It was a video call. Meridian General Hospital, room 412. Linda Harper, propped up on pillows, an oxygen tube in her nose, her skin the color of old paper. Beside her, Beth Dawson held the tablet steady. Behind them, flowers from strangers filled every surface, the windowsill, the table, the floor. Linda raised one hand. She waved. Her lips moved, but no sound came through. Mason looked at the screen, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled. He didn't look away. He sat down at the piano, the same piano the show's professionals used. Nobody had asked him if he could play. He hadn't told anyone. Linda had taught him when he was 7, on a keyboard she'd bought at a thrift store with 2 dead keys. He played the opening chord of You Are My Sunshine. Slow. Simple. The same key Linda sang it in every night beside his bed. And then he sang. Not the audition version, not the gospel version, not the jazz version. This was something stripped of everything except the truth. His voice was low at first, almost speaking, the way Linda used to sing it when she was too tired to project. Then it rose, gradually, like the sun coming up over a flat Mississippi field. Not sudden, not dramatic, just steady, just certain, just there. On the screen behind him, Linda closed her eyes. Her lips moved with his. She knew every word. She had written them into his bones. Mason's voice climbed to the bridge. The high notes came clean and bright, hanging in the air above the audience like something you could touch. A man in the 4th row took off his glasses and pressed his fists to his eyes. A teenage girl in the balcony sobbed into her friend's shoulder. And Richard Cole. Richard Cole sat behind the judge's desk, with both hands flat on the surface. His face was wet. Not from a single tear sliding down for the cameras. Wet. His shoulders shook once, then again, and he brought one hand to his mouth to keep whatever was inside from coming out. Mason sang the last line. Please don't take my sunshine away. And the note held. It held longer than it should have. It held until the silence swallowed it, and the only sound in the theater was 15 million people breathing at the same time. Then the screen behind the stage changed. Not the hospital feed, something else. A graphic. The Nashville Tribune logo in the corner. Claire Bennett's byline at the top. A birth certificate. Full screen. 5,000 people reading it at once. Father, Richard A. Cole. Mother, Linda M. Harper. Child, Mason R. Harper. Then the photographs. Richard and Linda outside 5th Street Baptist. Young, smiling. His arm around her waist. The ring on her finger. The same ring Mason was holding in his left hand right now. Then the timeline. Richard leaving Meridian in 2006. Linda, 5 months pregnant. No forwarding address. No child support. No contact. 17 years of nothing. The theater didn't gasp. It didn't scream. It went silent the way a room goes silent when something breaks that can't be fixed. 15 million people watching. Every camera in the building turning toward the judge's desk, toward Richard Cole. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He sat in his chair with his hands still flat on the desk and his face still wet. And he looked at the boy on stage. The boy he had buzzed, mocked, sabotaged, humiliated, called trash, told to sing at his own mother's funeral. And for the first time in 20 years, he saw his son. Mason stood at the piano, the ring warm in his hand, the screen glowing behind him. 5,000 people staring, 15 million more at home. He looked at Richard Cole. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Someone counted later, a producer reviewing the broadcast footage frame by frame. 11 seconds of dead air on live national television. No one spoke. No one moved. The birth certificate stayed on the screen, glowing white against the dark theater. Then, Elena Whitfield stood up. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at Mason. She pressed her hands together, brought them to her lips, and then she began to clap. Slow, deliberate, each clap landing like a heartbeat. Derek Simmons stood next, then the front row, then the middle, then the balcony. 5,000 people on their feet for the third time that season. But this time, it wasn't for the voice. It was for the boy. The executive producer cut to commercial. When the cameras came back 4 minutes later, Richard Cole's chair was empty. The announcement came 30 minutes after the broadcast ended. Voice of Tomorrow's official account posted a single statement. After a thorough review of conduct throughout this season, Judge Richard Cole has been removed from the panel, effective immediately. The competition's integrity is our highest priority. It wasn't enough for the internet. By morning, Claire Bennett's full investigation ran on the front page of the Nashville Tribune. 17 years of abandonment, laid out in court records, rental agreements, and testimony from neighbors who remembered the night Richard packed a single suitcase and drove north without looking back. The article included the photograph from Fifth Street Baptist. It included the ring. It included a quote from the landlord on Poplar Street. She stood at the window holding her belly and watched his taillights disappear. I never saw her cry after that. Not once. The story spread the way wildfire spreads in dry country. Every major network picked it up. Entertainment outlets ran hour-long specials. Social media didn't just trend, it detonated. Hashtag Justice for Mason. Hashtag Father of the Year. Hashtag Richard Cole is over. The hashtags stacked on top of each other like bricks in a wall that Richard couldn't climb over. Pinnacle Records issued a statement distancing itself from its founder. 3 major artists dropped their contracts within a week. The board of directors called an emergency meeting. By Friday, Richard Cole had resigned as CEO. No press conference, no farewell, just a 1-paragraph letter that used the word personal 4 times and the word sorry 0. Mason didn't read any of it. He was in a room backstage when the host announced the winner. He was sitting on a metal folding chair, holding his phone, looking at a photo of Linda. The same photo. The oxygen tube, the thumbs up, the smile. Mason Harper. He heard his name through the wall. Then he heard the sound. A sound so loud it vibrated through the floor and up through the legs of the chair and into his chest. 5,000 people screaming his name. He walked out. The host handed him an envelope. $100,000. Mason held it with both hands and stared at it like it was a letter from someone he'd been waiting to hear from his whole life. Elena Whitfield met him at the edge of the stage. She took his hands. Juilliard has a full scholarship with your name on it. Voice program, 4 years. I made the call this morning. Mason opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He nodded. That was enough. By the following week, Linda Harper had been transferred to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, one of the top cancer treatment facilities in the South. The GoFundMe, combined with Mason's prize, covered every bill. The shoebox behind the winter coats was empty for the first time in 2 years. The doctors started a new treatment protocol. They didn't promise anything. They never do. But they said the word options, and for Linda, that word sounded like music. The clip of Mason singing a cappella with a dead microphone became the most watched video of the year. 230 million views, more than any Super Bowl halftime, more than any presidential address. A boy in ripped shoes, standing alone on a stage, singing with nothing but his lungs and his grief, and a love so heavy it bent the air around it. Meridian renamed its youth music program. They called it the Mason Harper Foundation. The first rehearsal was held at Fifth Street Baptist, in the same room where a woman named Linda once taught her son that a voice was the one thing nobody could take from you. 6 months later, Mason Harper walked through the iron gates of the Juilliard School, with a backpack over one shoulder and the gold ring on a chain around his neck. The buildings were old. The hallways echoed. The practice rooms smelled like rosin and wood polish, and decades of voices layered on top of each other. He called Linda every night. Sometimes she answered strong, laughing, telling him about the nurse who snuck her pudding after hours. Sometimes her voice was thin, and she fell asleep mid-sentence. On those nights, Mason held the phone to his mouth and sang, "You Are My Sunshine," until her breathing settled. The treatment was working, slowly. The doctors still wouldn't say remission, but they'd stop saying hospice, and for now, that was enough. Tommy visited in October. He brought the jar, the same one Mason used to count coins in every Sunday night. It was empty. Tommy had cleaned it, polished the glass, and taped a label to the side. For when you need to remember where you started. Mason put it on his desk, beside the ring. Richard Cole wrote a letter. Plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from a small town in Vermont, 3 pages long. Mason read it once, folded it, and placed it in the bottom drawer of his desk. He didn't write back. Maybe not ever. But he kept it. On a Tuesday evening in November, Mason stood on the stage of Juilliard's recital hall for his first solo performance. 200 seats. No cameras, no judges, no red buttons. He sat down at the piano, closed his eyes, took a breath. And for a moment, he was back in Meridian, back in the trailer, back on the edge of a bed, listening to his mother's voice wrap around him like a blanket he never wanted to leave. He played the first chord. He opened his mouth, and he sang. If Mason's story moved you, drop a comment. What song would you sing for the person you love most? And if you were paying attention, go back to the very first scene. Watch the judge's face when Mason says his name. It hits different now. Like, share, and subscribe.
So, this man sat behind the desk, looked his own son in the face, buzzed him, mocked him, sabotaged his microphone, because 17 years ago he worked out on the pregnant woman and thought no one would ever find out. But the truth doesn't forget, it agrees. Here's what Gatsby thought. Mason didn't win because the secret came out. He won when the cell cut off, and instead of breaking, he unclipped that dead mic, set it on the floor, and sang with nothing but his lungs and his grief. That wasn't talent, that was a mother's love coming through her son's voice. Linda Harper worked 3 jobs. His blood sweat towers so her boy wouldn't worry. Taught him piano on the thrift store keyboard with 2 deaf keys. She poured everything into that child. Richard Cole built an empire. Mason was built by a woman who had nothing and gave everything. But let me ask you something real. Who's in your Linda? Who poured into you when they have nothing left to pour? Who sang you to sleep when their own chest was hurting? Because Mason didn't just carry that ring, he carried her. Every note, every breath. Drop their name in the comments. Tell me who believed in you when nobody else did. Like, subscribe, hit that bell. Next week, another powerful man thought this money could bury the truth. A voice is the one thing nobody can take from you.